Hi, everybody. So I'm Diana Gray. I'm the Community Marketing Manager for UiPath America. And today we have Chris Bolin with us, who's an MVP, and he'll be presenting this session. And if you want to go to the next slide. So hopefully you guys know by now that this is an America Developer Community session, and we hold these in with our MVPs from Canada, Latin America, and the USA. And we encourage you guys to share your information. The whole purpose of these calls is for you to get to know us, for you to ask us about topics you're interested in us covering, and for you to just engage with us. So these calls are pretty down to earth. We also, if you do have any topics, you can just send them to me or just put them in the chat. We are recording this session, so I will be putting the URL to the recording in the chat as well. And if there's anything else you guys need, just let us know. And if you go to the last slide. So again, this is the last of 4 sessions. And with that, you can, if you need any of the recordings, again, reach out to me. But I'll make sure the last one is available tomorrow and put that information in the chat. So with that, I'll turn it over to Chris.
All right, I'm going to skip the agenda slide since you just kind of went over where we're at. Today, we're going to talk about how do you manage your workload as a UiPath developer. So we've already gone through your environment, kind of the people you work with, some of the challenges you'll face in your environment and with those people, and different kind of environments. Today, we're going to talk about workload. Now, if you're anything like I am, you may have, and I don't know how many of you are working in a COE compared to maybe how many of you are working for a consultant firm where you're building for a client, or how many of you are a consulting firm or that type of deal. But if you're like me, I work in a COE. At any given time, I may have 15 projects in my work in process. And so you kind of have to go back and forth between the projects. So I'm just going to give you some hints about what I've learned over my 6 or more years of doing this, building UiPath RPA automations. And we're going to start, and some of this we've covered already, like who determines your priorities. So your organization or the client you're working with may have different priorities. And in some organizations, especially in periods of tightening of the belt as it goes towards spend, or showing more profitability when you're facing headwinds in the market or whatever it might be. Typically, SG&A savings drive what's most important, or those very high yield FTE hours. So when your company or you do your metrics or your KPIs and you try and figure out your return on investment, you're looking at, if you're just doing what we call soft savings or qualitative savings, there's no hard cash savings. You kind of look at how many FTE hours I'm saving, and you try and put as best as you can a baked in dollar value to those FTE hours to show what your true return on investment is. Now, how the end manager of the benefiting manager, a group of your automation, how they use those FTE hours to reallocate or realign their own department, that's beyond what your scope is. So typically, at least in my COE, we always focus on SG&A opportunities first. And if we have an SG&A opportunity come up, it moves directly from the backlog into work in progress, regardless of what's already in work in progress. An SG&A opportunity always has priority, or the large qualitative impact that I was talking about. In some instances, in some organizations, you're going to get a story with a storyboard. This is what you're going to build. So you're kind of limited on the information you need. And I'm going to give you some hints about how to get more of that information and how to reach out and kind of fill that picture a little bit more holistically. And sometimes some people don't even have a say in what they're building. They're given something. I've worked with some organizations as a mentor where each individual is given a project and they work on that one project until they're done with that project, then they're given another project. So it just depends on your environment and how do you fit in low-hanging fruit. Low-hanging fruit, I mean, Like I said before on some other sessions, I don't really focus on individual automations. We focus more on departmental or cross-functional. An individual automation would go more to a citizen developer type of model, because if I were to build individual automations, that individual may leave. And then who does the automation? So we kind of try and avoid that. But we call those smaller ones low-hanging fruit. And the low-hanging fruit is what I filter in, at least in my experience, when I have a gap. Let's say I have a gap in getting some testing scripts to do my developer, my alpha testing, or I have an automation going into UAT, and so I have maybe a couple days while they're doing UAT, and I can fit in some low-hanging fruit. Those are those really small, quick builds, 4, 5, 6 hours, maybe less, depending on how good you are at your job. You kind of fit those in and you knock those out, so that it kind of keeps your day going and keeps your plate full while you have some other things that are pending. Documentation is going to be very important as you start to allocate your work and look at your workload. I'm going to share a modified kind of a process design document. Every automation you build should have documentation. If any of you have ever worked in software development lifecycle, documentation. So you'll always want to maintain documentation. I'm just going to share really quickly. I hope you can see this. Can you see a PDD, Diana?
Yes.
Okay, good. So this is kind of one of the old school UiPath ones. I know UiPath has changed theirs a little bit, but I've been old school, so I'm comfortable with the old school. I'm going to show you some major areas of the documentation. Your objectives. What is it that your automation is going to be doing? And if you don't have this, if you're given a storyboard or just a story and you're not giving this information, this is your opportunity to reach out to the business or to your client and kind of fill in these gaps. Because the more you know, the faster your build will be. And the more you know, the less exceptions you'll have to worry about and the better error handling you'll have. And the quicker you can have a turnaround on your automation from build to UAT. Business process objectives, your key contacts, that's pretty self-explanatory. Prerequisites, this is where I list everything that I require from the business in order to, or my business analyst, your business analyst may put this together. And the purpose of this document is also, as a side note, to make sure you and your business analyst are aligned. What do you need to build your automation? You need test scripts, you need signatures, you need security, you need flowcharts, perhaps, you need detailed process. Maybe when you're meeting with these people, you're recording your team's conversations, and those become part of your process design document. Prerequisites, very important, because if your prerequisites aren't there and you're starting to build, you're saying, hey, where's this piece that I need? And your BA, your business analyst hasn't gotten this, or you haven't addressed this, then you've got yourself a delay. Process overview, this is going to be the overview of the current process as it is. This is really good for building your KPIs and what kind of impact this will have. And this will come into play when we start doing scorecarding. And I'll show you an example of a scorecard we use to prioritize our processes, our projects. The applications that you're going to be accessing. And this is important because if you know all of the applications and your BA has listed them all, and all of that security has been covered off before you build, then you're in a good shape, better shape than if you run into an application and say, wait, I don't have security into this. I need to stop again and wait for that security. And sometimes security into applications, especially if you're dealing with service accounts, can get kind of haywire and delayed because of authorizations through the chain of command. So you want to make sure you have all your applications outlined before you start your process build. This is your process flow diagram, and I love to flowchart. Flowchart makes sense in my brain. I don't know why, it just makes sense in my brain. And sometimes you'll see me, or actually you won't see me, laying in bed at 2 in the morning on my Microsoft Surface flowcharting, because it just helps me organize my processes in my brain. You may not be a flowchart fan, but flowcharting is great, especially if there's other people like me that are going to come after you or working or that are sitting in your client that you're building for example, or the group you're building for. People understand flowcharts, visuals better than paragraphs, okay? And then this is your flow chart as is. This is the process as it is. So these numbers on their steps should correspond to the task steps in your flow chart. So you have task number 1, task number 2, things like that. And I'm going through this quickly, and we have a lot of information to cover today, so I'm kind of going through it a little bit quicker. The supporting documents. Now, in here, I embed my documents. I embed my team's conversations, my recordings. I embed anything that's given, emails that are given to me by the business. Examples of outputs. Signature documents or signature emails approving access to certain confidential information. System access approvals. I embed all of those into my PDD. So my PDDs get very hefty. They get very large because I store all my documentation in the PDD. Because if I kept it in an email or a shared drive or something like that, there's a better chance I'm going to lose it. If it's wrapped up in my PDD, then it's available for other people to use as well. And this is the process flow diagram that I'm going to be building. This is how I'm going to change this process. This is how how the bots are going to operate within this process. And sometimes that means changing the whole front end of the process. When you're doing an RPA as an RPA developer, a lot of your work is also continuous improvement. If any of you are Six Sigma black belt or green belts, Lean Six Sigma, you're going to be using a lot of that skill set in taking an original process, which may not be necessarily amenable to RPA, and making it amenable to RPA. So this is going to be the process flow of what your project's going to look like. Again, it's very visual. You don't have to do detailed, but you can make it as detailed you want, but it's very visual. You don't want it high level, but not necessarily always in the weeds. And the change improvements. These are things that need to be done prior to your automation, or changes that are done in the process itself, the original process, to make it amenable to RPA. This is continuous improvement information here. And this is anything that's already automated. You may have Alteryx within your work scope or within your organization or your client organization. How's your RPA interacting with Alteryx or Power Automate or Automation Anywhere if you're a dual RPA house? OCR engines. What part of the process is already automated and where do you pick up in that process? And you may also list if any of you are using Action Center or task mining or anything like that. You may also list some of the details from that here. In scope for RPA, this is a level set with your business team. This is what RPA is going to do. This helps to prevent scope creep. This is what you're going to do with your bot or with your automation. And then you're going to have out of scope for RPA. These are the things you won't do. Typical things on my end, at least, that my bots do not do is we do not push buttons that say pay without a human in the loop validation prior to that, kind of like an Action Center. We do not upload journal entries into an ERP system without some sort of validation, things like that. That's where we would detail this in out of scope. And this is where we start to get into your business exception handling. Business exception handling is a break of the rules you set up with your business team. They're telling you this is how the process is going to be. You've agreed with them. You've aligned with them. This is what the process is going to do. Let's say they send you a data set with new columns in there, or different columns in different areas, or something different that you didn't originally plan in your original process. This is how you're going to describe what the bot's going to do if it encounters a business automation or business exception handling, business rule exception. Typically in my world, everybody really knows that if my bot encounters a rule break on your part, my bot's going to stop and you're going to have to fix your rules, or we're going to have to realign on rules. But my bots typically would stop. Application error exception handling. This is, let's say you're an Oracle house and your Oracle ERP system is down for maintenance and no one told you. Or you're using a SaaS solution that you really don't own. It's in the cloud. You have no say in what they do. And this happens more often than you think. And they decide one day, well, it's time to update our UI. or it's time to update our access points or how we look to the customer. Because if it's a customer-facing SaaS solution, such as a bank application or something like that, their main primary focus is their end user, the end customer, and not you. And so they're going to change it to match their customers' needs and not necessarily your needs. And they may never tell you. So this is where you're going to detail what's going to happen. Is my bot going to retry? Is my bot, if it's totally changes, my bot going to stop? That kind of deal. And other requirements and observations. And this is anything else that isn't already listed in my PDDs. And this is usually, this in my world goes several pages. So my PDDs are very developed, very organized so that anybody that comes in after me can look at my process design document. And I also distribute these out to the business team when we build for them and to their managers and to their executives so they can review the PDD, because I require all of those people up here to sign and approve it. And that just means that everybody's aligned, okay? So documentation is a very important part of how you're gonna manage your workflow. If you don't have the proper documentation, this is a rule in my any COE I've ever been part of or had any sense of mentoring, I always stress you have to have your design and your documentation in place before I even start to build. That includes your business continuity documentation. And most companies are going to be very lax at this on let's document how the process is before we get to RPA. And let's maintain that in a business continuity perspective. So if something happens, we have documentation of how this tasks work. Whether it's RPA or not, you want to make sure your organization has business continuity documentation. And in the COEs that I am involved with, I always stress business continuity typically falls into the internal audit world or the controls department of your organization. Sarbanes-Oxley would be falling in that same group. They're required to maintain some sort of business continuity. And so anytime something comes across my desk saying, okay, I need you to build this, first thing I ask is, where's the business continuity documentation? I call it BCD. Where's the BCD? And they know what that is. And if they don't have it, then we set it aside until that is given to me. So I want to make sure that when RPA comes in, we have a full view, holistic view of what the process looked like, what the process is with an RPA bot, what the process may be after the RPA bot. Systems access documentation. That would mean if you're going to a SaaS solution, you can request that solution to send you release notes. We're going to update our system every 90 days or every month. Some solutions, if you ever work with Coupa, do it maybe once every 3 weeks. They will send you documentation of what that update's going to involve. And so you can read that documentation and determine beforehand how that's going to impact your automations. If you think it's going to impact your automations, then you can set aside some time, notify the business teams that are using those automations and say, hey, we're going to shut your automations down for about 5 hours on a Friday or a Thursday to do some testing against this update. This is going to save you incredible amounts of time doing maintenance. Data sensitivity approvals. This is very important if you're dealing with payroll information, HR information, benefit information, income statement information, balance sheet information. If you're working with vendors, assigning vendors and systems, and you have access to their taxpayer identification information or their bank and routing information, anytime that you're going to encounter, because vicariously through building, you're going to have access to that information, whether it's test or not. You want to make sure that you've gotten the proper approvals up the chain of command saying everybody's aware that you're going to be vicariously able to see this information, and anybody that comes after you is going to be able to see this information. So you want to make or have access to it vicariously through an automation. So you want to make sure that you have all the sign-offs so everybody understands that. And if there's any hesitation on any of those levels, you want to make sure that's addressed. We don't ever build, especially when dealing with PII, we never build unless we have a full complement of authorizations from all the levels that need to be involved. We talked about Teams meeting recordings. If you want to record keystrokes, if you want to watch somebody and shadow somebody and record what they're doing, you can do that, and you can attach that to your process design document. Talked about flowcharts. Subject matter experts. Who's your subject matter expert? Very important to manage your workload and to manage maintenance is you filter everything through one person, if at all possible, one SME, because that's going to help you prevent scope creep and help you from getting all those little voices that come across your desk through a Teams ping, a Skype, or a Slack, or an email. You want to filter everything through one SME. And then storing your documentation. You want to make sure that it's stored in a way that's safe, especially if it involves access to PII or anything like that. And you want to store it where it's going to be protected under a business continuity rule. That's usually going to go through your internal and your controls team, and stored in different places. We store ours in AWS S3 clouds as well as in SharePoint. We don't use share drives, so we store it in several different places to make sure that if it's not in one place, we know where it's at in another place. All right. Again, can't stress enough documentation in doing your RPA builds. Templates. You only need 2 templates to build as an UiPath RPA developer. Just 2, an RE framework and a modified RE framework for linear automation. I'm going to show you how to, if you've built before, you know what an RE framework is. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I teach that as well, but I'm going to show you how to change an RE framework into a linear framework during this session. Those are the only 2 you need. You can use an RE framework for transactional or database. You can use a linear framework for everything else. Even if you're just doing a small email management, low-hanging fruit, I urge you to put everything in a framework, or either the RE framework or the RE linear framework, which is just a modification of the RE framework. And then where you store it, I get Azure DevOps, somewhere like that where you store all your things. Configuration files. Each RE framework comes with a configuration file. Where do you store that? Do you store that wrapped up your automation when you publish it into your DevOps or your Git, or do you store that outside of that? I typically store mine as an absolute address in my configuration file. I will store my configuration files in AWS S3. And that's simply so that if I just have in my configuration file the business team name, and let's say they change their distribution list email or whatever it might be, I don't have to redo my whole automation, republish the whole automation, go in and check it out of Git or Azure DevOps, because it's already pointing at this configuration file that's stored outside of that automation. All I need to do is change the configuration file. So you want to really think about how you store and where you store your configuration file, because if you wrap it up in your NuGet package, then you have to check it out and republish it and things. And in some organizations, you have to go through, depending on what industry you work with. If your industry is regulated by the government, you have to go through some sort of change control process that can be documented. And it could take a week for you to get your automation republished with just that configuration file change. This master configuration file, some organizations, me included, will use a master configuration file. That master configuration file will contain such things as a URL for your production ERP system, a URL for your test ERP system. If your ERP system is on your client on your desktop or in your system, a location for that. Any specific navigation strings that you use consistently, we put those into a master configuration file that's maintained outside of everything else. Again, for that simple reason of being able to change things on the fly and not having to go through the whole rework of your automations. And we talked about storage and what alternatives. Then you want to think about, as you're building, how's the passwords managed? Are your passwords just simply managed in Orchestrator? Or are you bumping up against a CyberArk or a LastPass, some sort of password management tool? You want to have all that in place before you start building. Have all this planned out on how you're going to do it before you start building, and you can even put that on your flow charts. Oh man, I'm talking fast because we're already 30 minutes in. I'm sorry about that. I'm going to show you really quickly how to, let's talk about scorecards first. I don't think that's, yeah, let's talk about scorecards first. I'm going to show you the scorecard I use. And can you see an Excel spreadsheet, Diana?
I see a spreadsheet, yeah.
Thank you. This is a scorecard, and it's just an Excel with some formulas, but what we've done is we've broken it down into certain categories that are pertinent to what we feel in our organization are different criteria, KPIs, however you want to say it, criteria for an automation. So we'll go through it real quick, and I'm just going to show you what we do. Basically is when we're building it, we're just going to put a check mark against what category it meets. And the higher you score, the more priority it's going to be. So if we talk about FTEs, how many FTEs is going to replace? What's the volume that you're going to be dealing with if it's transactional or database? How much is the manual time per transaction? Is it documented? Do you have your BCD in place? Some people call it disaster recovery documentation. How many applications are you going to touch? If you're going to touch 6 or 7 applications, you may want to think about doing some different automation setups instead of one. Does your process require a human in the loop? Is there somebody that's going to have to determine something before your bot picks it back up and runs to the finish line with it? Do you have regulatory compliance? Is there a reduction in risk to your organization by doing this automation? And what kind of security does your bot need? Is it going to need new security? Is it going to need exclusive security for just one automation? Are you replacing systems? Are you replacing third-party solutions? For example, in my organization, we're working right now to replace Alteryx. Are you going to see a cost reduction either through an FTE, not backfilling of open role, rolling off a contractor, rolling off consultants, rolling off individual contractors? Number of major process variations. Excuse me. What's the process stability? Is that process, does your organization, are you doing a stopgap? Does your organization plan on changing that entire process in the next year, 6 months to a year? Are they asking you to do a one-time emergency automation to just get them through a certain period? What's your upline impact and downline impacts? Who relies on the information you're outputting from your automation? What people are you relying on inputs? Does it involve PII? If it doesn't involve PII, is there internal data segregation, segregation of duties, reusable code? I'm going to show you this in a minute. We always build with reusable code. Are there already code segments that you've built for other automations that you can bring into this automation and use? Do you have a test environment in your system? We never want to test in production as much as possible. We want to test in a test environment. How many data sources? Are you going to have 10 different data sources? If so, you might want to think about a different route to your automation. Is it cloud-based or is it on-prem? There's not many on-prem anymore as we're all moving away from data centers. Your application owners, have you talked to them? If you have a third-party application owner, have you told them you're going to be bringing a bot into their application? Some people say, well, don't tell them that because then they're going to learn and they're going to say no. Well, you want to be upfront and tell them you're going to have a bot in their system so that they're aware that you have a bot in their system. If they say no, well, then you just can't do that automation, but you always want to be transparent. Are there other solutions? We never, or I never, in my experience with COEs or doing our RPA, I don't bring something to our automation really until we've exhausted all other solutions we have with all other applications we have that we're already paying for. And then that just scores us down here on functional complexity. And you can see these are all separated by technical, process, functional complexity, impact score. And this is going to give you an overall score that's color-coded to red, yellow, or green. And I would take the time filling this one out. Let's see. We may come back and fill this out afterwards just so you can see it. And I'm happy to share this with anybody, but we use this as part of our intake process of setting our priorities. And we meet once a week and we say, okay, these are what we have in our backlog. What's the most important? And the scorecard is part of that determining factor. It's not the whole thing. It's just part of that determining factor. What's the impact to the organization going to be? And that's how we measure it with this scorecard. All right, let's change a RE framework into a linear framework. So if you can see my screen, you can see that we have an RE framework. So it's a straight out of the box RE framework. First thing I do with any of my frameworks, RE framework or linear framework, is I'm going to go in here into this initialization stage. And I know in all of my automations, there are certain things that I'm going to do. Now, we're an Outlook house. We're an O365 house. We use Outlook. And there are some things we do in Outlook that we cannot do through the APIs going into Outlook. We can, because we do a lot of archiving in Outlook for our audit firm. Our audit firm sometimes will request the initialization of that request, even though we can save that email off into a folder. They want to see when that email actually came in. So we'll store those things in Outlook. So I know in each one of my automations, and I'm going to show you, I have to build certain things, and I create a template, and I'll open up my template for you so you can see that. If I can get to my file, I'm sorry, I'm in my archive right now. Bear with me 2 seconds while I find that. And I will show you my template for an RE framework. So I will use the same template for every RE framework that I build. And you can see when I open this up onto your screen that I pre-build into my template things that I know are going to happen in every automation I do. Even if I don't open a browser, I'm still going to create an error pathway for a browser automation. I just don't put anything in my initial application. So you can see I create my own paths for certain exceptions. And you can create as many paths as you want for exceptions, but everything I put into my RE framework as an exception, here's my Outlook, is going to be done in a try catch, where I identify an exception and I change that into a system exception. You can see that I do everything in my browser, even if I don't have anything, I'm not opening a browser, I just don't put anything in here, right? But I still have this browser in there because I'm using a template. So I want this to be available every time. So I don't have to rebuild the RE framework from the ground up. I always do an asset variable, and that's just where I'm reading my URLs or my bot signatures or my bot names or my bot emails, whatever it might be. So everything I do is done in here, and I will always give a path out if any of those error out of my RE framework template. And I'm just going to save this as a template in my Git, in my Azure DevOps. I'm going to check the template out each time, build my automation, and change the name simply by going over here to this cog and changing my project name here. So I'm still maintaining my RE framework. I've just created a new automation out of this template. Now, if I want to change this into a linear template, the only thing I'm going to really do is I want to get rid of this guy. Now, I'm going to show you how most developers do this. It is not the way that's going to help you pass your UiPath UiArt exam if that's what you're going to do. There's a different way that UiPath recommends to do this, but you'll find that most developers are going to do it the way I do it. And this just could be because we're old school, but it is what it is. So I'm going to show you how I do it because that's how I'm comfortable. I'm going to first start by taking this little guy, this business exception, and I'm going to move him. I'm going to try and move him over to my end process. Okay. I'm going to take my system exception that's going to my get transaction detail. I'm going to move him over to my end process. Try to at least. Okay. This guy is a no data, and he's dealing with transaction items. And I'm doing linear. So I'm not really concerned about this guy. Okay. But what I want to do, I'm going to just delete this guy. I'm trying to delete it. I'm going to take this one up here, and that's just going to be simply my success. Okay. That means if I had a successful run, that's this guy right here. Well, that's this guy. That's my system exceptions. Oh, wait, I did the wrong one. Sorry, guys. Let me take that out. This guy. This is my system exceptions. I want to move him over to my, come on, over here. And that's why I didn't see that guy, because I already have my success here. So everything pointing from here to here to here. Now I can take this guy out, right? But first I want to take this guy. And I'm going to move him down here. I'm going to remove this get transaction data. And if you're like me, I'm a little bit OCD. I want everything to line up. So I have created a linear transaction in UiPath. And I use this template. Again, I'm going to go up here to my initialization state. And I'm going to do any predefining of anything I might use, whether it's initial applications, using Outlook, reading my variables. Those are something I always have in every automation. I read some reference files, a date file, or whatever it might be. And I'm going to connect anything that could possibly be an exception to my end process state over here. And to change these bad boys, you just can go in here and change this, and you're just go in here and put your condition. Let's say if your Outlook error, which is what I create inside my initialization state, nothing. That means I'm going to go and it's going to create an error over here to my end. That means I had an Outlook error somewhere up here. It's going to create it to the end. It's going to take it to my end process. Okay. Now, some people just change these guys up in your initialization state, the system errors. I happen to be, like I said, a little OCD. I like to track how many errors I have because I like to measure how many times Outlook fails on me, how many times I have problems with Excel in my initialization state. That gives me metrics to take back to my IT department if I ever have any complaints about Outlook performance or whatever it might be. The only other thing I do in this is I'm going to go down here, my process transaction to my set transaction status. And I'm going to remove this guy. And that's just my retry transaction. I'm not going to retry any transactions in this. So I have just created a linear process. And I can do a click through in this. If I'm clicking through a system just to download a web page, if I'm just going to read a PDF and I'm just doing email management, I've just created a linear process to do that. And I will save this as a template. And I will show you my linear process template. And I use that for every linear process that I have that's not transactional or based on a database with transactions where I'm taking each line of a database and creating a separate transaction out of it. Or if I'm using a database in a RE framework for any other reason, I just create a linear process. And this is my template. And I store this in Git or Azure. And for everything I do, it either goes in this one or an RE framework. You only need 2 frameworks. That's going to prevent you from rebuilding the wheel each time you start an automation. So you never want to build everything from beginning to end in a sequential automation. So you always want to do it in a code segment. Code segment is when you're going to go into your automation. Where's my, pick up that linear. And let's say I'm here in my process state and I'm in process transactions. I'm always going to create a new flow chart. I don't do many new sequences. I always do a new flow chart because it gives me more flexibility for error handling. I'm just going to call this build 1, and I'm just going to point it at what I call a common folder. And there's a common folder in here. And I'll show you the purpose of a common folder in a minute. And I create it. And now I build a code segment. I don't go through beginning to end. I go through beginning to a good transition point where I can build another code segment. And the reason you want to build in code segments is because it's going to help you in maintenance, so that if you have something break at the beginning that doesn't impact the rest, you're only changing one code segment, not your entire automation. So we both building code segments. Now, common folders. A common folder is something I have in every automation, but I also have a master common folder in my Git. We use Git. You may use Azure DevOps. I use Git. A common folder holds everything I've ever built as far as code wise. And I'm going to show you an example of a common folder in an automation that has quite a number of them. So a common folder, if I build open up Outlook, or I build open my ERP system, or if I build open a third-party system, and I'm building that common folder, that code, just to get past the login page to a home page, right? And I stop there and I don't go anywhere else. That's where my code segment stops. I put that in what I call a common folder. I'm just throwing this into an old share drive just to show you. So I can put that in a common folder, and then I can reuse that in any automation I want to that involves accessing that system. I don't have to rebuild the whole login every time I build. I use that code segment. I keep it in the common folder. I copy it out of the common folder. I put it into the common folder for my automation, which you can see is right there. Well, it was. No, I'm sorry. You can see my common folder is right there. Every automation I build has a common folder, and I just fill it with code segments. And I've just cut off 50–60% of my build time by just using pre-built reusable code that I don't have to rebuild again every time I start an automation, right? So at the onset, I'm 50, let's say 40–60%, depending on what you're building, complete with my automation. The rest is all just what I have to build new just for that automation. Again, no end-to-end sequential processes. Let's talk about libraries. Some people say, well, instead of a common folder, I use a library. You can create a library in Studio. However, be careful, because if you, and I have a library where I log into my ERP system, and sometimes I'll invoke that instead. Just remember, if you're going to tweak a library that you have in Studio without renaming or creating a second library item for that, then you've just changed that library item for every other automation you have using that library item. Okay? So when you need to, if you're going to create a library item that's a little bit different, you're logging into your ERP system, and you want to take it one step further, and you want to go to a different page, then you want to create a separate library item for that particular change, or otherwise you're changing that library item for every automation that may use that one login library item. So just be careful when you're creating libraries that you keep track of where that library item goes, and you want to make sure that you have some documentation in your design document or your PDD that says, hey, I'm using these library items, and these are the names of my library items. We'll get into a technical design document in a minute, because that's going to be the last thing you do after building. Exception handling is built into your RE framework, but one thing I do on my RE framework, so let's go back to my linear, is every time I have a new path going out, I'm going to put a screenshot in. And I'm just going to take a screenshot. You can see I already have it in there. And that's going to show me what the bot sees that I can't see, because all my automations work behind the scenes. Nothing, I don't sit here and watch automations all day. So I can see the bot's going to take a screenshot before the bot ends, and he's going to show me what he saw that made him error out. So I always have and I'll have screenshots in the middle of a process, taking a screenshot of a transition page, taking a screenshot of something I had problems designing that's not consistently working sometimes. I have one now that today found out that the number of lines that the bot's entering, my indexing for my tabs has to change a little bit. So I had to take a screenshot to show me what cell that bot's actually working in. And every automation I have does an email generation. It generates an email, number one, if I have an error. because again, I don't sit there and watch my bots run every day. So if you work with UiPath in the cloud, you know you can access your UiPath bots on through your mobile phone, right? So when I'm not at work, I can log into my UiPath mobile app and I can see what my bots are doing. And my bots will send me emails if they can't do something or if they got hung up. And also more importantly, is when a bot receives a request from a person or a business team to do a task, the bot's going to send that team an email saying, hey, I received your request. I'm going to start your task within the next how many minutes, or I'll start your task at the preset time of 11 o'clock. That just so the business team knows that their email was received or their request was received or their team's message was received by the bot. And then you have an email generation when it's done. If you're putting an output and that output's going back to the business team, you do an email generation. If you need that business team, then go out to an AWS S3 bucket or a SharePoint site, look at a document, whatever it might be, you want to send the business team an email. Remember, you want to communicate with the business team through your automation. Technical design document. I think I had one pulled up. I'm going to just do a quick example of the key areas of a T. I call it a TDD. They call it a DSD. This again is something from UiPath. I'm just going to scroll down here. Project name, the robot type, attended, unattended, citizen developer, whatever it might be, are using Orchestrator. Everything I do uses Orchestrator. More specifically, what queue are you using? Is it scalable? Any runtime guide? These are instructions that are required for your runtime. List of packages. When you first publish your automation, you want to list the packages that you used in your automation and their version. And the way UiPath stacks packages, it gets a little confusing. If you're on an older version, you can't use the most recent package in many instances. You want to make sure you read the details of the packages, which is probably well outside of the realm of this conversation. But you want to list those here so that whoever's coming back in, or you, after 2 months, don't remember what the heck you did in this automation, you can get a general idea by reading your own words in a TDD. Runtime details, project details, workflows, other debugging tips, areas where you had problems during UAT, areas where you had problems during development. You want to list all that in a TDD or DSD, whatever you want to call it, because that's going to become then your Bible as a developer to what that automation, how it was built. And if you ever win the lottery and the Mega Millions and decide not to share with me and Diana, by the way, that's required to come to these sessions. But anyway, you can, whoever comes behind you can look at your TDD or your DSD and know what you did. Talked a little bit about source control backup already. Annotations, labeling, and numbered flowcharts. You want to annotate everything. Annotate everything. You want to tell what every step, every sequence, every click is doing. And you want to label those little blue boxes differently. You want to show them, and I don't think I can show you anything without violating company policy, but let me see if I can find an example. Because you want, in your log messages, when you label, that's going to appear in your log messages. If you create a log file, that's going to appear in your log file. When you annotate, it's going to tell whoever's coming in. I think this is like kind of a little bit of an example that I won't get in trouble for. So I'm going to annotate everything that my sequence is doing. And when I get into my sequence, I'm going to label every part, every step of that sequence or that flow chart, whatever. If I put a click or type into, if I put a log message box, or if I put a for each loop or an if statement, I label everything and annotate everything. That way, whoever's coming in after me can know what I did, or I'm coming in 2 or 3 months later, I've done 15 or 20 automations between now and when this SaaS solution decided to change. I can go back into my code and I can see exactly what that code was doing. I don't have to dig around for hours trying to figure out what I was thinking when I built this and why did I think it this way. I have a DSD, TDD, I have annotations, and I have labels on everything. Gosh, that's a lot. And I'm sorry, I just shoved that in down your throats in an hour time. Does anybody, and anybody knows this, this is one of my favorite quotes. If you haven't looked at your code for 6 or more months, you might as well have been written by somebody else. And that's so true. When you're going back to doing some sort of maintenance or modification of your code, if you haven't dealt with that code in a long time, you've built a whole bunch of automation since then, you have to refresh your memory on what you did. Okay, any questions about anything?
I don't see anything in the chat, so if anybody wants to unmute themselves and ask any questions, please do.
Well, that was easy.
You sure?
It was a lot. I gave a lot of information in an hour. So I know that some people are going, what just happened to me? If you need an example, or you want me to reach out to you, or you want to reach out to me and show you how to do a linear framework, do so. If you want a copy of my scorecarding, ask for it. I'll take anything that's proprietary out of that. If you want a copy of a PDD, I'll take anything that's proprietary out of that, or give you a PDD and tell you what goes in what space. So I just ran through maybe 3 or 4 academy lessons in an hour.
So you just had a question, what is PII?
PII, personal identifying information. So let's say you're working with vendors, you have a bot that's loading vendor information into a system. Let's say you have to load it into your ERP system. If you think about PII, an organization, a company's given a taxpayer identification number. If you're a sole proprietor and you're the plumber for your organization, or a single sole proprietary vendor, your tax identification number is your social security number. So if you give me that information, I not only have your social security number, I have your bank account number and your routing number. So that's PII. And typically, we want to be very careful when we're dealing with PII, names of individuals and addresses, birth dates, if you're ever dealing with payroll, anniversary dates, benefits, garnishments, things like that, child support garnishments. You want to be very careful of that if you're dealing with any type of that PII, and you want to make sure that everybody that's involved in that process knows that you can see that information, and that anybody after you can see that information, if they come in to maintain it or take over your operations if you decide that leave the organization. Because your management may say, okay, Chris, you're leaving, so we want you to turn this particular automation off because we don't know the person very well that's coming in. We just hired them. We want to make sure they're vetted through the whole process before we allow them to see PII. Because if you think about that, you have all the information that you could probably steal someone's identity. And so you want to make sure that you have all that signed off with. That's what PII is.
So Chris, I just put our email addresses in the chat. You were very generous to offer some tools if anybody wanted it. And so if they want to reach out to you and copy me, you'd be glad to send that to them.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. So make sure you grab that information, you guys. That's good stuff to have.
And I know that Diana and I are going to do another series in September, hopefully, right, Diana?
Right. Mm-hmm.
On exception planning, error handling, and debugging. Those 3 subjects specifically.
Yeah. So if you guys are interested in additional sessions, we have some coming up on AI. We have the one Chris just talked about. Yeah, you just go to community.uipath.com and you'll find those in there as soon as we release them. But feel free to join us on LinkedIn too, where we promote most of the sessions we do, and you'll find out about them. Any additional questions, you guys? Hold on, I think I do have one. What is your take on using an REF for a linear process followed by multiple transactions? For example, download a spreadsheet and then process each transition. Do you use two process, dispatcher performer, or one process with linear part in the initial stage?
So if, good question, if I'm using transactions, I'm using to get transaction data, I'm going to use a dispatch performer model. So I have a bot that's filling my queue, and then I have bots that are emptying my queue, especially if I have a queue trigger. So if there's something dropped in the queue, depending on the priority of that queue, those items in that queue, the bots will immediately start processing it, right? If I have a spreadsheet, a data file that's a spreadsheet, and each one of those comes through as each line item is going to be a transaction, I'm going to follow a dispatcher performer model. If it's a linear process, I typically on linear processes, if I'm downloading a spreadsheet from a website or my ERP system, and I'm just manipulating that data, or I'm joining it with spreadsheets from other parts of my ERP system, so that my accounting team has a view of inventory turnover ratio, I'm not going to use a transactional. I'm going to use a linear RE framework. If I'm doing an email management, I'm going to use a linear. If I'm going to do just a simple click through, where I'm going to a website and I'm downloading reports, a third-party website, and the team's going to use those reports in their own way, and I'm not automating those, but I'm just automating the report downloads because it may be persistent. Persistent meaning that it may take a long time to download those, and it's easier for a bot to do that overnight than it is for a person to sit in front of their computer for 6 hours to download 30 reports from a vendor website. In those instances, I will use a linear framework. I won't use a transaction. Hope that helped.
Perfect. Great. So I think I put in chat also where you guys can find the recording tomorrow. So make sure you grab all the information in the chat. And I think that was our last question, Chris. So thank you very much. And thank you all for coming.
Thanks, guys.
It's a great session.
Thanks.